Before I begin today, I think it's important to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. So what am I going to talk to you about today? Well, I'm going to illuminate some of the longer term trends that have emerged from the 30 years worth of data we have in this monitoring program. We're going to look at police custody and prison custody separately, and then we're going to identify the main drivers for the trends in these two settings. And finally, we're going to look at some conclusions from the data. As Adam mentioned, the National Deaths in Custody Monitoring Program is one of the core programs here at the Institute. Looks at deaths in prison, police and juvenile custody, and was established in 1990 in light of recommendations from the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. Now, the purpose of this monitoring program is to monitor the deaths in custody and to provide accurate, regular information that will contribute to policies and programs that aim to reduce deaths in custody and also to increase public understanding of the issues. Data are provided by custodial authorities, usually within a matter of days of the death occurring. It is then cross-checked against coronial findings as they become available. The role of the National Deaths in Custody Monitoring Program is to look at the following items. What were the circumstances that led to a person dying in custody? What was the cause of death? Who was responsible and what can be done better in the future? Now, the NDICP collects information that assists in answering these questions and serves as an ongoing accountability and performance measure for custodial authorities. It also identifies emerging issues and trends, as well as future challenges for custodial authorities in endeavouring to reduce the number of deaths in custody we see each year. If we look now at some of the longer term trends, we can see that between 1980 and 2008, we had a total of 2,056 deaths in custody, 1,260 of these in prison, 779 in police custody and related operations, and 17 in juvenile detention. We can see that most deaths each year occur in prison. Considering people are generally held in prison for longer than they would be in other custodial settings, it's not surprising that most deaths in prison occur when compared to other settings. But now overall, there's been a curvilinear trend in total deaths in custody, in that from 1980 to the early 1990s, the trend was upwards. It then remained fairly stable from 1993 to 2001, and has since been trending downward over the last 7 years. Since 2006, there has been a rise in total deaths, but numbers remain lower than seen in the late 1990s. Since 1980, Indigenous persons have accounted for 17% of all deaths of prisoners. However, the proportion of total deaths, of prison deaths each year involving Indigenous prisoners has ranged from between 4% in 1981 to 31% in 1995, and that's the peak in the red dotted line there. Interestingly, the rates of death for Indigenous and non-Indigenous prisoners have generally fluctuated between 1 and 6 per 1,000 prisoners since the early 80s. There's been less fluctuation in the rate since 1999, with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous rates of death converging. Most importantly, however, is the fact that rates of death have declined significantly for Indigenous prisoners since 1995 and for non-Indigenous prisoners since 1997. Now, you might ask yourself, well, what has been causing this rise in deaths in custody since 2006? Well, if you look more closely at the types of deaths occurring in prison in recent years, we can see that more older prisoners are dying from natural causes than ever before. Indeed, in 2008, both the number of persons over 55 dying in prison and the number of deaths due to natural causes were the highest ever recorded in over 30 years of monitoring deaths in custody. Now, contextualising this, ABS data show that the median age of the prisoner population has risen by approximately 5 years over the last decade. And this most particularly amongst the non-Indigenous cohort, which make up about 75% of Australia's prisoners. Now, moreover, the proportion of prisoners aged over 55 years has also steadily increased. So we're getting more and more older people in prison than we've ever seen before. As the prison population ages, health issues associated with ageing impact on deaths in custody. the median age at death for all prisoners, including Indigenous prisoners, has been increasing over the past decade. Now, by way of explanation, the median age is the middle out of all the persons dying within a group, such that half is above and half is less. Now, we use median age because it's a more reliable measure of central tendency than the average age when you're dealing with quite small populations. Now, for Indigenous prisoners, the median age at death has risen from a low of 24 years in 1990 to a high of 50 years in 2007. And similar trends can be seen amongst the non-Indigenous deaths in custody. Now, what are the main drivers for this? Well, the number of 40 to 54-year-olds dying in prison has increased by 67% since 2006. And for persons over 55, they've increased by 58% over the same period. More generally, 30 out of the 37 people, or 81%, who died from natural causes in 2008 were persons aged over 40 years or older. And the median age for this natural cause death cohort was 52 years. So in other words, those persons dying of natural causes in prison are much older than the median age of the prison population. Looking more closely now at cause of death in prison since 1980, we can see that from the late 1980s until the early 2000s, deaths resulting from self-inflicted injuries, such as hangings, were generally the most frequent cause of death in prison each year. However, over the past decade, this pattern has changed dramatically, with natural causes now the most common cause of death in prison each year. The National Deaths in Custody program also collects information on the specific type of natural cause death that people died from. Since 1980, we can see that 441, or 90%, of the 490 deaths in prison that were attributed to natural causes have been further classified under one of these 10 specific classifications. The remaining cases had insufficient information to allow classification, or the coroner found that the cause of death was undetermined. So of these 441 natural causes, 47 were due to heart attack or heart disease, 18% were due to cancer, 10% to respiratory illness, and 7% were due to multiple medical serious conditions. So there's nothing murky here. We're not trying to hide something. These natural cause deaths are people with serious medical conditions. And this raises some implications for custodial authorities. Importantly, however, over the last 20 years, hanging deaths have generally outnumbered all causes in prison each year. However, since 2000, hanging deaths have been on the decline. Reductions in hanging deaths can be partly attributed to efforts to reduce hanging points in prison cells throughout Australia. Data is also collected in this program on hanging points and materials used since 1990. For the 340 cases where information is available, cell bars accounted for 39% of hanging points, other fixtures 36%, and shower fixtures 13%. Bed sheets are almost always used. Moving now to police custody deaths. In 1994, the definition of a death in police custody was expanded to include deaths occurring during police custody-related operations. Before 1990, only deaths occurring in institutional settings, such as police cells and watch houses, were included in the NDICP database. There are two types of deaths in police custody. Category 1, which is the institutional settings, raids and shootings, and then there's Category 2, which is sieges and motor vehicle pursuits. Between 1990 and 1999, Category 1 deaths, raids, shootings and institutional settings, were generally more numerous than Category 2 each year. However, since 2000, Category 2 deaths, those occurring in sieges and motor vehicle pursuits, have become the most common type of police custody death each year. An examination of total deaths occurring since 1990 shows that the number of deaths occurring each year remains stable between 1990 and 2000, peaked in 2002, and then declined each year to 2006. Now in 2008, there was a small increase from this 2006 low, but numbers remain much lower than levels recorded at the start of this decade. It is also important to note the different trends that have emerged since 1990 between Category 1 and Category 2. Category 1 deaths have declined significantly since 1990, while Category 2 deaths increased but have since declined. Overall, we see that Category 2 deaths are more numerous each year than Category 1. In 2008, most deaths in police custody and related operations were due to injuries sustained from gunshots, either self-inflicted or by police. This was followed by 11 deaths attributable to external multiple trauma, usually as a result of a motor vehicle pursuit, and 2 deaths were attributed to natural causes and other. There was also 1 hanging, 1 head injury and 1 drug overdose. Now importantly, 27 of the 32 deaths that occurred in police custody happened while the police were attempting to detain or in the process of detaining the individual. There were 4 Indigenous deaths in police custody and related operations, and this was the same as the number recorded in 2007. We can see, however, that the ratio of Indigenous to non-Indigenous deaths in custody in police operations has dropped to just under 1 in 8, after reaching a high of more than 1 in 3 in 2002 and 2005. For deaths in police custody, the proportion of those dying who were Indigenous is used as an indicator of overrepresentation. Unfortunately, reliable rates for deaths in police custody cannot be calculated, as consistent data on the population basis, i.e. the total number of police custody incidents every year, is not currently available. And we're looking to try and get this in the future. Now, of all deaths in police custody recorded by the NDICP since 1980, 23% involved Indigenous persons. While the number of deaths of Indigenous persons has remained relatively stable over the last 2 decades, the proportion involving Indigenous persons has dropped in recent years. In 2007 and 2008, some of the lowest historical proportions of deaths involving Indigenous persons were recorded. And this drop is in part due to higher numbers of non-Indigenous persons dying, mostly in the process of being detained.